All right, so here we are. It's Tuesday. Here's some stuff that I want to tell you. Thing number one, who one of you has your profile picture in the hallway of Cedar Park High School? I recognize those tiles. Um, Here's what we need to talk about. Thing number one, I had this conference that started on Thursday and ended Monday, and I had meetings from like 7 in the morning till 11 at night. But guess what I didn't do over the weekend? Okay, so I'll try to do that tomorrow. That would be grading. So if I'm behind, I'm sorry, man. And you didn't want me grading then anyway. Plus, this hotel didn't have very good internet. So what the heck? I know. How is that even possible in the 21st century? So I'll get caught up and I apologize. Thing number two, due dates. So we technically have two weekly questions due this week. If you can at least do the first one, that would be cool. Okay. We'll talk Thursday on what we want to do officially about due dates for questions 3 and 4 and the quiz. Here are my thoughts. You don't have to agree with me. This is not one of those, I'm the professor and you're the student, so you'd better agree with me. That does happen like usually when I'm grading and you disagree with me, I'm probably right. Maybe not always, but mostly. This is more of a, here's what I think, you tell me if you agree, because my perspective, teacher perspective might be different than student perspective. So I don't think it's a good idea, excuse me for that, sorry, to postpone the quiz beyond spring break. I really think you should take it before spring break. Here's why I think that. I do not believe that you, as primarily second semester seniors, are going to think, hey, it's spring break, I'm going to study for my history quiz. That's not what I think is going to happen. Here's what else I think is going to happen. Instead of, in addition to doing whatever you do on spring break, you might forget some history stuff. Yeah, you might forget some stuff. So you're not going to study and you're going to forget some stuff. So I think you should take the quiz. We should leave the quiz due date the same. As far as the weekly question due date, here's kind of what I'm thinking, which you again don't have to agree with. Oh, somebody's driving. Be careful. I really just think one of the weekly questions should be due on Friday. Oh, she's done driving. One should be due Friday, and maybe we have one due like next Monday or Tuesday, and the other one due the Friday before spring break. Or I know one of you just went, no, that's not cool. I can see it in your eyes. Or we can have one due this Friday, one due next Friday, and then one due the Monday that you get back from spring break. And that way, if you want to do them all before spring break, you can. There's nobody telling you don't have to. But if you need the time to catch up on the weekly questions over spring break, that gives you time to do that. So you get to think about that until Thursday. Okay. That's your job. Think about that until Thursday. Oh, I should let this person in. Let's do it. Okay. I really don't care when those weekly questions are due. What my only thought is, I'd really like for you to be done with the weekly questions for Unit 2 before we start Unit 3. That's my only thought. Whether you take the week over spring break to work on one of the questions, and honestly, if you turn in 3 on time and 1 late, I don't even really care which one is late. I don't care. I know that the weather put everybody behind, plus you already had a little pandemic funk going on. Book report, book review. Oh, isn't it around the 1st of May? I don't remember. I'm supposed to remember that. Let me see if I have anything open that will help me. Yep, I do. How about that? Let's see. Oh, could I share it maybe? I don't know. Let's look. Dang it, where'd you people go? I only do Zoom meetings 50 times a week. How come I don't know how to do this stuff? No, that's not it. Crud, that's you seeing how I'm loading my YouTube videos. I loaded a coaches meeting on there too. Let me try this again. Dang, sorry. Don't watch the coaches meeting. It's not that good. No, I don't see it. Poop. All right, let me just look really quick. All right. I should be able to find it in the folder, right? Where the syllabus is. The syllabus, yes. Syllabus. Spring ACC 1301 syllabus. Surely I made one of those. Revised 1302 calendar. Why don't I see it? There we go. All right. Dang. Okay. Old people. I know. One of you already found it. I don't even care. I opened the syllabus. We're going to look at it. Book review. Wow, I made it do that late. What the heck was I thinking? May 7th. That's really late. We'll also have book review chat next week because historically speaking, lots of times people work on the book review over spring break. Maybe they start reading the book. So next week, I'll remind you about the book review. So book review, oh, sorry if everybody just saw that. Book review due May 7th, which is a Friday. Yeah. Okay. All right. And let's look at weekly questions. And then we'll get started on stuff. Weekly questions. You see my little crooked weekly question thing there? All right. Do you see the weekly questions? Yes. Okay. Thank you. All right. So you've already turned in probably number 5, which I've only graded a few of because, the weekend was not fun. How did women, number 6 is how do women, and these go along with the chapter number. So chapter 6, the women react to the language of freedom and liberty. Be sure to include in your response Abigail Adams' opinions that appear in Voices of Freedom, the little section of one of her speeches or letters. And then number 7, how did the framers of the Constitution balance the competing claims of local self-government, sectional interest, and national authority? And then one of my all-time favorite questions from one of my all-time favorite history people, who was John Marshall and what makes him a significant figure in U.S. history? You're going like, yeah, he's my fave too. You don't even know who he is. Don't be like that. Okay, maybe you do. Supreme Court Justice. Be sure to discuss specific writings, events, or court cases in your discussion. So we should be able to get through discussing all of 3 of these over the next 3 or 4 class periods. Today we'll kind of get through the women thing, although we'll kind of wrap it up at the beginning of next class. And then we'll definitely get to the Constitution thing by the end of next class, in case some of you want to get both of them done this weekend. And that'll give us time for John Marshall and then maybe a quiz review on Friday, potentially. Potentially, could happen. All right, is there anything you want to say before we get started with notes? Okay.
No. Oh, so can you repeat our 2 options for when the assignments are due?
Yeah, maybe there's 3, I don't remember. So right now, the way they're due is you've got 2 due this week, which I don't think we're going to do, and then 1 due next week. We could switch it to 1 due this week and 2 due next week. We could switch it to 1 due Friday, 1 due middle of next week, 1 due end of next week, or we could switch it to 1 due this Friday, 1 due next Friday, and 1 due the Monday you return from spring break. I know some of you are going to like put it off as long as possible. I think I honestly don't care. I really don't care at all. I think putting a weekly question during spring break is not the end of the world if that's what you want. Plus, you still have the option of doing it before you go. But, you can always turn it in. Just turn it in when you're done. And also the same, like if I'm where I was this weekend, for whatever stupid reason, there was not much internet. I know it's so weird in the modern era. So I didn't see a couple of your emails that said, I'm really sorry, can I turn it in late? Just always turn it in late. Just turn it in as soon as it's done, unless the class is over. So don't turn it in the end of May. But other than that, I was trying to figure out who just came in. Who just, who did just come in? Oh, well.
I got kicked off, but then I came back in.
Oh, okay. Then I already counted you present. I'm sorry. I got so confused. All right. Story of my life. All right. Davis, did that answer the question, even though?
Yeah,
Okay.
that was good.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah,
All
as
right.
long as that they're not, 2 questions aren't due this week.
Yeah. No, I figured that was probably going to be a bad call for most of you. Why is that thing still open? Probably because I have it open. Dang, I have a lot of things open. Oh, there's the YouTube. Are you guys still there? Did I get rid of you? Nope, there you are on the edge. I see you now. Okay. Well, yeah, these are my sketchy notes. I forgot. Okay. All right, I think we're ready, maybe. So, let's see if I can go through the list pretty quickly, and then maybe we can talk more about women than I did with the earlier class. So, state constitutions during the Revolutionary era. Here's what I would note about state constitutions. The farther north you are, the more concerned they are about individual freedom. The farther south you are, the about having individual freedom, and they're more concerned that a single governor might have too much power. If you're in a slave state with a lot of slaves, the exception of Virginia, which is weird for a lot of reasons, but if you're in South Carolina or Georgia, they probably have a pretty strong governor system, and they don't want anybody thinking much about freedom because in those states, majority population are slaves. So they don't want to talk about freedom too much. Most of the colonial or state constitutions during the Revolutionary era have a very weak governor because they're afraid of George III, and they don't want to set up mini George IIIs within their own state. And they give more power to the legislatures, and they have lower property or wealth requirements for people voting because they think the more people voting, the better off you are. In plantation states, they're not as concerned about that because they kind of like it when the 5 guys that own plantations get to run the state. So they're in a slightly, they see the world in a slightly different way. Oh, that was weird. All right. So weak governor systems and more power to the legislatures and separations of power. I mean, you see that some, but their main concern typically is they don't want the governor to have too much power because, you know, George III, they're still a little nervous about him. All right, anti-Catholic sentiment in the US. I think, we talked about this before. I think it's weird for those of us who live in, well, we all live here, don't we? It's weird for those of us who live here to see anti-Catholic sentiment because, you know, there's Catholics here and it doesn't scare us. Any of you guys scared of Catholics? Probably not the time to say so. But, you know, this place used to be Mexico, and before that it used to be Spain. And you probably heard both those countries really fairly Catholic. However, East Coast, they don't feel quite the same way. They don't feel quite the same way. Their concern is that people who are Catholic also like those systems where you have a really strong monarch, something like that, because Catholics have the Pope. And those of you who are Catholic really understand this. The Pope controls every decision you make. You guys know if you're Catholic, it's like, what would I have for breakfast? What would the Pope have for breakfast? Should I skip school today? Would the Pope skip school today? But the Pope would not. No, he would not. Should I do my history homework today? The Pope would do his history homework, I'm certain of it. But their concern was that people would be more loyal to the Pope and to the church than they would to their country, and that they would be controlled by their religious belief, which was not very egalitarian. They really saw the Catholic Church as being authoritarian. They did. So, and plus they have this "we hate Spain" bias. So it's mixed in with, I hope that you're gathering, I'm sorry that I sort of stopped in mid-thought there. I hope that you're gathering that the religious concerns that people have during this era are pretty similar to the religious concerns people had in the Middle Ages, where they're really more rooted in, I don't know, social custom and maybe tradition rather than actual theology. Do you gather that? It's like, I don't think, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't think that Jews and Muslims really just wanted to kill each other. It's like, you know what? I just hate Muslims, I'm going to kill them. Or I just hate Jews, I'm going to kill them. I think that their thought was, we want to spread our influence. No, we want to spread our influence. I mean, they didn't sit down and talk about theology, is what I'm trying to say. It's like, what are you thinking about Muhammad? Well, what do you think about God? Well, and then some Christian shows up like, let's talk about Jesus. That wasn't going on. It's like, we'd like your land, so I think we'll kill you. That was my impression. So I think that this England hates Spain isn't really so much because they're Catholic, it's because they're Spain. Yeah. And the fact that Spain happened to be Catholic made you want to hate Catholics. That makes sense. I don't mean you, but you know what I'm saying. Okay. But there's pretty strong anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. There tends to be some French Catholics hanging out in Canada. The last chapter talked a little bit about frustration with the Quebec Act and allowing some Catholic liberties in the part of Canada that used to be French. So there aren't a whole lot of Catholics in the United States. Many of them came from either Ireland, which wasn't highly esteemed by the British, or from maybe Spain. And they probably lived in Maryland or on the borderlands, you know what I'm saying? The edge of the country, which would have been the Appalachian region. I know it's not it's not very far west, but for the era, pretty far west. All right, so when people are talking about religious freedom, separation of church and state, it doesn't mean necessarily that they want to be Catholic friendly during this era. And you see anti-Catholic sentiment from time to time, you do, in our history. And I think, I know, because I'm a history teacher, our current president's only the second Catholic president we've ever had. Were you aware of this? I know, I'm here for trivia for you. It's JFK and then this fellow being Biden. I didn't forget his name. Yeah. All right. Okay. We'll keep going, I think. So anti-Catholic sentiment, fairly strong. There are not a lot of Catholics, and it's really as much anti-France or, we like France better at the end of the revolution, but anti-Spanish as well. Okay. The book talked about Thomas Jefferson for a while, and it talks about his statement on religious liberty, which he is quite proud of. I think it's called the Virginia Statute on, I don't want to lie to you. Let me look it up. Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. So I think it's sometimes called the Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom. So he's very proud of this. Later on, like close to death, he is going to list his 3 greatest accomplishments as founding the University of Virginia, this statute on religious freedom, and the Declaration of Independence. Those are 3 pretty good ones. He also was president twice and did the Louisiana Purchase, which he didn't think were nearly as big a deals, which I think is kind of interesting. So this establishment of religious freedom, it starts the idea of a separation of church and state. He doesn't call it that, but he calls it a wall of separation between religion and the state. So there you go. And it's just the idea. It's not that, you want a government that says no church, and you don't want a church that says we are the government. You want 2 things that work separately. You don't want a situation where your church leaders automatically become your secular leaders, your political leaders. You also don't want a situation where your political system prevents people from church from being involved in politics. So separation of those different realms. And the book talks quite a bit about the religious beliefs of the founding fathers, which is, that's tricky, right? Talking about people's religious beliefs, because we could talk about my religious beliefs if you want. We don't want to. But I mean, you could talk about the church that I attend, which I won't mention, not because I'm embarrassed or ashamed, but because, it's class. But the church that I believe also has a statement of belief. And it may be that some of those beliefs I don't completely agree with. Actually, most of them I do, but at any rate, it's like you might be Catholic. There's a good chance it's Texas. So you might be Catholic, but that doesn't mean that everything that's ever happened in the Catholic Church that you approve of. And it also doesn't mean things that are that the Pope says. You go like, nope, I'm with that. I'm down with that. Yeah. It may not be true. So talking about the religious belief of the founding fathers and saying, like, we could say Ben Franklin's a deist. Say that because, well, it's true. Ben Franklin was a deist. Why we can say it. We could also lie, but we try not to do that in history class. But there were times where Ben Franklin thought that God did intervene in day-to-day life. Like at the Constitutional Convention, he either thought God was going to help intervene or just said it because he thought it would be helpful convincing other people. Really hard to tell with Ben because he could have done either. But there's a point at which he says we need to stop and pray. A deist would not stop and pray because the deist thinks God set everything in motion. It's all going to work out, however it works out, that God doesn't intervene. But every once in a while, Ben Franklin asks for prayer. So saying that they're all deist, yeah, they weren't all deist. But even when they're all deist, occasionally we're not what we think we are. Like, what is the old saying? There are no atheists in foxholes. Usually when you're in a spot, you may ask for divine intervention, even if you don't believe that divine intervention is possible. However, back to business, maybe. Did I scroll somewhere? I did. How did I do that? Sorry. Religious, what were we talking about? Jefferson.
We were talking about Jefferson or how
Yeah.
what his greatest accomplishments.
Yeah, because he said the statement of religious separation. The book talks a lot about the founding fathers' religion. So some of their religious beliefs will lead them to think that slavery is wrong. Ben Franklin's going to be one of those guys, not so much because his day-to-day religious practice, which is fairly non-existent, leads him to that conclusion, but his Quaker background from living in Pennsylvania. He was raised in Massachusetts, but also in Massachusetts, even the Puritan guys weren't Congregationalists at this point weren't really big on slavery either. And Congregationalists are much more likely to think that everyone should get to vote because they're used to everybody participating in church government. So I think what I'm trying to say is in the modern era, I think we have the impression that when the church influences the state, it's almost always bad. Like, oh, the church, they're the ones with the crusades and they burn witches and that sort of stuff. But sometimes the church also says, let's have public school and end slavery. So, we don't want to make a blanket statement. And honestly, I think historically, it's tricky to say because the Holy Roman Empire was bad and the Crusades were bad and a lot of bad. But a lot of the modern reform movements come from religious people as well. So, tricky stuff. But that's also why the Holy Roman Empire and Crusades and stuff, also why the founding fathers were really so adamant about making sure that the people who run the church also don't run the country. Because, yeah, when you think that everything you do is ordained by God, you probably aren't compromising much, and you probably don't think you're wrong very often. Yeah, so there you go. All right, so Jefferson's accomplishments, he thought that the bill for establishing religious freedom was his most important thing. And it was really, that you didn't discriminate against people because of their religion. I will also mention to you, as we've already said, people weren't that keen on Catholics. There's not a whole lot of embracing of our Muslim, Buddhist, and Jewish friends during this time period. Also, we don't have a lot of Muslim, Jewish, and Buddhist friends within the United States in this era. I'm not saying there aren't any. I'm saying there are few. There are some, but few. I would say, well, certainly more Jewish folks. And you see groups within large cities, New York City, and then for whatever reason, Maryland, because of the founding with religious tolerance. And then I would say if you're looking for Muslims or Buddhists, you got to look New York City. Yeah, because when it was Dutch and international and there was trade. All right, we're going on. Separation of church and state. I feel like we just talked about that. Do you feel good about that? The other thing I probably should say is in the colonial days, there were states that paid taxes to pay the preachers. So your taxes paid the local minister, whether you went to church or not. During this era, they get rid of that. Yeah. So, and that's a weird thought, isn't it? Yeah, I wouldn't do that now. I wouldn't have done that then. It's not good. All right, my opinion. But I have this nice American bias where and in the modern era, that doesn't happen very many places that I'm aware of. Yeah. All right. John Adams, land ownership. What you see in Massachusetts is a lower standard of wealth or land ownership for voting. Remember, Adams, Massachusetts, Connecticut as well. These are those Puritan states, Congregationalist states where they really think everybody's voice matters, where everybody's also more likely to probably own land, and there aren't as many poor people. So this is where you see the most egalitarian rules on suffrage. You're going, what language are you speaking? So egalitarians, where everything's fair and even and equitable for white guys. I'm talking white guys during this time period. And suffrage is the right to vote. So egalitarian rules regarding suffrage. They let the most white guys vote. So only the super poor white guys probably don't get to vote, and there aren't that many of those in Congregationalist states, which are primarily, as I mentioned, Massachusetts and Connecticut. If you're wondering where do they let black guys vote, yeah, maybe Massachusetts and Connecticut if they own land. And they wouldn't have to own much land. And it's possible there because, you had indentures and free blacks in Boston, that sort of thing. And Pennsylvania, because of the Quaker heritage, possible. And for whatever reason, it sounds dumb, New Jersey, but I don't know I can't remember if this book talks a whole lot about the history of New Jersey. I used to use a textbook that did, and I thought it was interesting, but probably not important. No offense if you're from New Jersey, but New Jersey was supposed to be a Quaker colony. And then the Quakers fought with each other, which isn't very Quaker-like. And then the royal governor took over and said, you Quakers aren't in charge anymore. So it does have a Quaker heritage a little bit. And it also, crud, I think when I was just getting out of college, Jersey Shore, it has that heritage as well, which is weird. People wear a lot of makeup that's not the same color as their faces. All right, Adams and land ownership. U.S. policy toward Native Americans. Oh dear. That's just never good, U.S. policy toward Native Americans. And during this time period, probably not, I don't know. So what's going on here? Once the United States has gained its freedom, it's renegotiating agreements with Native Americans on the borderlands. The states that are stronger, more powerful, more likely to have a larger militia, they are going to push Native Americans to the frontier. They want them farther west. And also because England is kind of out, if they're middle or southern states, then those states are going to want to probably try to develop trading relationships with the Native Americans. If they're closer to Canada, there's still going to be Native American trading relationships with the North because Canada is controlled by England. So it really kind of depends on where you are. And it also mentions states like Massachusetts will talk about how certain tribes can stay within the state, but the state leaders have guardianship over them. There are going to be certain tribes that get to maintain, if they become part of like what they'll eventually call the 5 civilized tribes and they have written documents, then they clearly have natural rights and they'll get to preserve those and write treaties until we decide they don't, a couple of presidents down the road. Cherokee are going to try to fight and maintain their land, but going to lose and get pushed either farther west or into Georgia. But U.S. independence is probably not a good sign for Native Americans. At first, there may be, you know, in the middle and the South, there may be some moments where there's going to be something cordial that occurs. But as the United States gets stronger and more populated, Native Americans are going to get pushed farther and farther west. And I know none of this is a shock to you. You've had a U.S. history class before, so you know that there's really no era in U.S. history where we can say this is a really good time for Native Americans. Once white folks arrive here, it just kind of doesn't go well. You know, people go, I'm taking that land. All right, maybe that wasn't specific enough. If you want to look for more stuff, all the details, actually the book is pretty brief on it as well. 236. And it talks about certain tribes that have a little bit more freedom than others. It talks about Joseph Brant in New York. But the problem was for Native Americans, a lot of those groups during the American Revolution sided with England, because they were probably the ones who sided with England during the French and Indian War, because the ones who sided with France had already kind of, you know, that didn't go well for them. So the remaining ones had probably sided with England during the French and Indian War. And there's a good reason for them to do that during the American Revolution, because it looked like the British would win. And then when the Americans win, they really hold grudges against people that, you know, sided with England or didn't side with them. They even harass Quakers, because Quakers wouldn't choose a side. Because they're Quakers, they don't choose sides. All right. I don't know if that helped or not, but we'll keep going. Why did slave ownership increase between the Revolution and 1800? That would be 1774 and 1800. It's a good question. Let's see, we have a good answer. I can think of a few reasons. People started making more money on plantations. That's probably one reason. Also, slaves were having kids, and the people who owned those slaves also now owned the kids. So there's that. But you see the expansion of slavery during this time period possibly is an ironic thing, when the idea behind the revolution is that people have a natural right and a yearning for freedom. So if you have natural rights and a yearning for freedom, and we start owning more people, that seems to be a problem. The book is going to talk a little about how there's two different philosophies about whether freedom and slavery go together. And that's, you really see the divide between what we'll think of as the North and the South, but slave owners and non-slave owners developed before the Revolution and talked about during the Revolution and talked about during the writing of the Constitution and talked about all throughout our history. I think as kids, like little kids, we're sort of raised to think, well, you know, you had slavery, but nobody really thought it was wrong. And then at a certain point, you know, middle of the 1800s, people went, oh, the slavery thing, we should rethink it. And then we went, oh, that's wrong, we've got to get rid of it. Except the South said, no, we kind of like it and we want to keep it. All throughout our history, colonial history to, you know, the Civil War, people understood that there were ethical problems with owning people. And they talked about it. I mean, it's not a secret. It's mentioned anytime that there's a governmental discussion, because, you know, owning people is a problem. It's an ethical problem at best. That would be the understatement of the day. So when they're talking during this era about whether owning slaves is a good or bad idea, there's some guys who just openly say, like, clearly it's a bad idea. That's going to be guys like Hamilton, who doesn't really own any slaves, or John Adams, or Benjamin Franklin. You know, they're Northern guys, their wealth comes from different places. Southern guys, plantation owners, they of course benefit from slavery, and they're either going to see that it's economically beneficial, or they may even convince themselves that it's beneficial to slaves. You'll see a discussion later, not so much in this chapter, about how slaves wouldn't be able to take care of themselves without oversight from white people, which is a lovely racist thought. And also you may see some discussion about how, you know, it's that Christianizing slaves was really a good not theological, but religious purpose for slavery. And there, that's not a terribly, even they, I don't think, really thought that. But in the discussion they talk about in this chapter is that the reason slavery is beneficial to freedom is because it provides economic freedom for whoever owns the slaves. Now, that's probably true. It probably does provide some economic freedom for whoever owns the slaves. It's not so good for the slaves. Yeah. So slavery makes freedom possible for white people because it gives them time to focus on things other than manual labor. Yeah. We're so fond of the institution of slavery in the early days that we won't even write the word in our founding documents. This is how troubled we are about knowing that slavery is wrong, but knowing that we benefit from it and we don't want to get rid of it. So we recognize that from the earliest days of our history. We're just not good at dealing with it. We don't know the best. That's not true either. We know what the best thing to do, like, well, not everybody agrees that freeing the slaves would be a good idea. I can say that and be comfortable with that. I think you and I know what the best thing to do would have been. They were not sure that the economic loss was worth the, philosophical cleansing. And some of them didn't think there was a need for the philosophical cleansing, or the ethical cleansing. They thought it was completely fine. There are probably a handful of them that did. And others that talked themselves into it, I think. All right, let's see. So self-government without outside interference is crucial to independence, and requiring slave owners to give up their slavery would make them economically dependent again and would reduce their governmental independence. I know it sounds iffy. They did say that. I don't know if they really thought that, but they did say that. And then the book's going to talk quite a bit about people who are Quakers who start producing little pamphlets that say, here's how you know slavery is wrong. They're definitely going to discuss it anytime there's a Continental Congress, when they get together to write the Constitution. There are going to be slaves and former slaves who will start writing petitions for freedom, where they will quote some of the founding fathers who happen to be slave owners, or they will discuss philosophy of John Locke. And they will talk about how if there's a natural yearning for freedom, who wouldn't have it more than a slave? So it's going to be problematic, and there's going to be a lot of dissonance between the idea of owning slavery and establishing a country based on freedom and natural rights. Yeah. So if you ever thought they just ignored that, they definitely discussed it. They just didn't resolve it. All right. The book also mentions, so I don't know that we answered why slave ownership increased during that time period. Let's see. Why did slave ownership increase during this time period? I would say because there were more people, because population increased in general, because plantations were getting larger, because we are starting to grow another cash crop that's going to be really profitable, cotton. So we're switching away from tobacco to cotton, and cotton farms are going to be larger than tobacco farms, and they're going to spread to the South and the West. And the book mentions that slavery increased from about 200,000 slaves to about 700,000 slaves during this era, between 1770, let's see the dates it says, 1776 to, that's probably 1790 census. Yeah, because even before we were a country, we took censuses, I don't know, censuses, we'll say that. But the wealth of plantation owners was increasing, so they're able to buy more slaves, plus their slaves are producing more slaves, and people are living longer as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. All right. Phyllis Wheatley, I always assume you know who Phyllis Wheatley was, but I could be wrong. You probably maybe will have a vague memory of her, but she is a poet, and she's a poet who makes enough money to live as a poet. I don't know, do you know any people who make enough money writing poetry that that's their job? Yeah. Do you even know people who read poetry in the modern? I mean, poetry's not as much a thing. When I was a kid, 100 years ago, 1980s, we used to have 80s and 90s, they would have the poetry slam, where people would get together and recite poems, and there would be coffee houses where people did that. I don't know if any of those people actually made a living, but there were some on TV that seemed like they probably did. But that's pretty rare. Phyllis Wheatley is a rarity. So she's a poet who makes a lot of money being a poet, and she also used to be a slave. So that makes her a Black poet, doesn't it? So she is a Black poet, former slave, who makes enough money in this era to be a poet. So that's a lot of kind of unusual things about her. She mostly wrote about her love of freedom, about Christianity, and her family. And she produced a volume or two of poem with poetry, with testimonials from founding fathers, and she was able to earn a living doing this. So she's pretty prominent. She doesn't have a super long life because nobody does during that time period, but she is very prominent, and you know, people know who she is. People know who she is. So that's a pretty big deal. And the book talks quite a bit about people who applied for petitions for freedom. And there's always a handful, even in this era, of prominent African Americans who influence the culture around them, the politics around them, even in times where it doesn't make sense politically or legally that they would be able to do that. So certainly, excuse me for the yawn. That happens during this era. Also, lots of African Americans earned their freedom, not millions and millions, but thousands, earned their freedom during the Revolutionary War because of a response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which is where the British told slaves if they escaped and fought for the British that they would earn their freedom when the war was over. So there was a response to that. And some slaves were able to earn their freedom by fighting for the American side in the revolution. Sorry. All right, let's see. What else do we want to talk about as far as ownership? Phyllis Wheatley, I feel like we got Phyllis Wheatley. Maybe not. Oh, and also, what the North is starting to do during this time period as far as slavery is you're starting to see gradual abolition and voluntary emancipation. You're starting to see a little more of that. In Virginia, you see some of that, but abolition is really much more of a northern thing. The way that most states began to get rid of slavery during this era, and you'll see it continue. And I know we just said there's more slaves than there were before. That's true, but it's because they're all in the South. They are. So gradual emancipation, the way that this works is, say, Pennsylvania makes slavery illegal, and they say, starting in 1800, all slaves are free. And it usually gave slave owners like a 5-year warning or a certain amount of time to prepare for, you know, having to actually pay their slaves if they wanted to keep employing them. There are really no slaves who needed extra time to prepare. That's always for the slave owners. And sometimes gradual emancipation was every slave is free at the age of 18 or by the year 1800. So, but most people in the North, at least philosophically speaking, are going to see slavery as contradictory to the new government based on natural yearning for freedom and natural rights. So, all right. People in the South, not so much. Yeah. All right. And if you're looking for like free Black populations, more so in the North, but also in the Chesapeake states. I mean, you see large populations of communities of free Blacks in places like Maryland and Virginia, but you're not going to see that as farther south. And you, at least for the beginning of this era, you're going to see some free blacks have the right to own property and thus vote. You'll see certain states, especially any slaveholding state, restrict that as time goes along. All right. We still have time, a little bit of time. We'll talk more about women next time. That sounds bad. We'll talk more about women next time. Sounds like we're gossiping or something, but no, about the place of women during the revolution. We'll talk a little bit more about that next time. But the book, the chapter starts with a discussion of Abigail Adams, who's a fairly prominent woman during this time period, in part because of who she's married to, but Abigail Smith Adams, her father was a pretty prominent Puritan minister who had a very strong formal education and thought that his daughters should also benefit from that education. So that same sort of classical education that he had, where you studied literature and math and science and philosophy, theology, probably Greek and Latin as well. That he made sure his daughters had that same sort of education. So John Adams, I think, properly understood that his wife was his intellectual and educational equal. Certainly as far as managing money, his superior. There's a lot of discussion of that with people who write about both of them, because he's really off doing, kind of the work of the country. He's doing a lot of governmental stuff and negotiating, and she's got to manage the family business. And what you will notice is that within his family, his branch of the family is the only one that really kind of maintains their money through this era, and most people credit it to her ability to manage money. So apparently the Adams dudes, not so good with money, but Abigail Adams, who was really kind of trusted as a partner rather than an inferior in the marriage relationship. I mean, I think John Adams understood who he married. The stuff that you see written from Abigail Adams, the book does a pretty good job of pointing out the idea that both Abigail and Sam, not Sam, Sam's the cousin, John Adams, oh my goodness, I am tired. Both John and Abigail Adams understood that their correspondence, their writing to each other, was going to be a historical record. So they knew that what they were writing, that you guys would get to read it someday. Not you by name, but they knew students someday would study it, that historians would see it as historical documents. So the reason that we tend to point that out when we teach about this era is, I think you're taught in earlier grades that primary source reliability is different depending on who wrote and why they wrote. Do you ever talk about that in earlier grades? Do you remember maybe elementary school? Okay, so primary source is directly from the person who's sharing their thoughts. Secondary source is where I talk about, or I write about somebody else's thoughts. And there's different kinds of primary sources. There might be like accounting records, there might be a diary, there might be letters. In the modern era, there might be text or video journals, and there also might be public statements. Typically, people think of letters as being much more reliable in some ways about telling the truth or people's actual thoughts because they're private. What I'm trying to say is these letters are public, and they knew that they were public when they were writing them. So this isn't really just a letter from a wife to a husband or a letter from a husband to a wife. These guys understood that they would become historical documents, so they wrote them carefully. I'm not saying they were lying. I'm saying they wrote them to make a statement. So Abigail Adams pretty consistently writes to her husband, especially like during the Constitutional Convention, to remember the ladies and make sure that women's rights are protected and that they have the ability to own property and they have the ability to make legal decisions. And not just be considered property or members of the household without rights. Because women certainly couldn't, as a rule, couldn't inherit property, couldn't make legal decisions, and a lot of times as well, because they couldn't own things and couldn't make legal decisions, they may or may not be able to get in trouble. But their husbands could also have them committed to mental institutions when they disagreed with them. That's going to be a thing for a long time in US history. It may not It's my opinion, not a good thing. You, of course, may have your own opinion, which you probably should not share with me if you disagree. But what you'll notice too about Abigail Adams is, she's going to advocate that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to have a free country but own slaves. She's going to talk about the rights of Native Americans. And these are not things that John Adams disagrees with. Adams may not push as hard in the same way because he's trying to negotiate with other people to make a document that pulls people together. So Adams will also, both Adamses will write commentary on political events. They mention one of the early kind of chroniclers of colonial history is also a woman named Mercy Otis Warren. And you may occasionally see quotes of some of her documents in the book. They'll also talk about, I think it's this book that talks about Judith Sargent Murray, who is an early educator from this era. And of course, we've already talked about Phyllis Wheatley. There'll be Quaker women's groups, and of course, Quakers, because they think everybody has a bit of truth within them. They tend to be more likely to listen to, women's petitions, that sort of thing. I'm going to stop because it's pretty much time to stop. The Voices of Freedom thing for Abigail Adams is on, page 248, if you want to kind of peek at that. And then next time when we start class, we'll really talk about the weekly question for chapter 6, and then we'll start to talk about the compromises constitution for chapter 7. Okay, we'll pause the recording.